Hello, and welcome to Encounters with Polish Literature, brought to you by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. I'm David Goldfarb, and I'll be your host. This is a banner year for English translations of the poetry of Zuzanna Ginczanka, a Jewish poet born in Kyiv who wrote in Polish and achieved fame at a young age and perished in 1944 at the hands of the Germans during the Holocaust in the Płaszów concentration camp near Krakow. If you know the least bit about Ginczanka, you probably know her last known poem written in 1942 that begins with three words from the Roman poet Horace, non omnis moriar, not all of me will die, a line invoked by many poets, sometimes seriously and sometimes satirically, to discuss the immortality conferred by poetry and by art in general, supposedly. This translation that I'll read now is by Joanna Trzeciak Huss, published in the journal Consequence magazine in 2020. Non omnis moriar. My proud estate, meadows of tablecloths, bastions of armoires, miles of bedsheets, all my fine linens and dresses, bright dresses shall be my bequest. Here I have left no heir. Let your hand then pick through my Jewish possessions, O brave spouse of a snitch, Ms. Chomina from Lviv, an eager informant, a Volksdeutscher's mother. May they suit you and yours. Why leave them to strangers? This is no song, dear neighbors, nor an empty name. I remember you the way you remembered me to the coming shupo, reminding them of me. So, friends, break out the goblets, drink to my wake and to your riches, kilims and tapestries, platters and candlesticks. May you drink all night, and as the day breaks, set off on your search for jewels and gold, in feather beds, mattresses, sofas, and rugs. Many hands make light work, so it shouldn't take long. Clumps of horsehair and seagrass stuffing, clouds of torn pillows and billows of down will cling to your hands and turn them to wings. And my blood will congeal fiber and feather and transform into angels those now merely winged. The poem begins with reference to her material possessions, satirically exaggerated in their quantity and value, and a certain Ms. Chomina, Zofia Chominova, a real person, a housekeeper in the building where Ginczanka was in hiding in the guise of an Armenian in Lviv, who betrayed her as a Jew to the Nazi police, the Schutzpolizei, or the Shupo, as they're called in this translation. Chominova would have remained to loot Ginczanka's possessions after she was gone. Ginczanka's friends were eventually able to bribe her way out of that situation, at least for the moment. Then, alluding to the Polish Romantic poet Juliusz Słowacki's poem, My Testament, written in the same meter, the poem turns to bitter irony. Słowacki, in his poem, asks as he is dying that his friends remember him and drink to him at his funeral, and imagines how they will be transformed by the memory of his selfless dedication to his homeland, and by the power of his poetry into angels. Ginczanka instead addresses her betrayer, rifling through her things and cutting open her pillows and mattresses in search of gold and jewels. And covered in her blood and the feathers of her belongings, the looters themselves will be transformed, ironically, into angels. Chominova would in fact be sentenced, rather leniently, to 4 years in prison in 1948 for collaboration with the Nazis, based in part on the evidence of the poem. As Ginczanka's work has become more accessible in Polish and is appearing now in translation, we can better appreciate the context of the poet who produced this searing final poem. Two collections of Ginczanka's work are out in 2023 in translations by Alex Braslavsky, entitled On Centaurs and Other Poems from World Poetry Books, and Elisa Valles, entitled Firebird from New York Review Books. So please check the bibliography on the introductory page for publishers' links to those volumes, as well as some excellent reviews that have already appeared and some related video content. Today, we'll be speaking with the translations of the next two Ginczanka translations, that's 4, due out in 2024. Before we meet today's guests, I'd like to thank everyone who has been following and supporting Encounters with Polish Literature, and remind you, click the thumbs up, ring the bell, subscribe, and leave a comment to help the program reach more viewers by moving up in the search rankings. Since we have 3 guests today, I'll keep the introduction short, but you can find out more about them on the introductory page for this episode linked in the description below. Anna Muller is the Frank and Mary Pajeski Endowed Professor in Polish, Polish-American, East European Studies in the Department of Social Sciences at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. She is the author of If Walls Could Speak, Inside a Women's Prison in Communist Poland, published by Oxford University Press in 2018, and a collection of oral histories with former political prisoners from Eastern Europe in Polish, as well as An Ordinary Life, The Journeys of Tonia Lechtman, 1918 to 1996, Ohio University Press, published in 2023. Mira Rosenthal is the author of Territorial, a Pitt Poetry Series selection and a finalist for the 2022 Indies Book of the Year Award, and The Local World, winner of the Wick Poetry Prize. You can read her work in journals such as Poetry, the New York Review of Books, Plowshares, Threepenny Review, Guernica, Harvard Review, New England Review, A Public Space, and Oxford American. Her translations of Polish poetry include Krystyna Dąbrowska's Tideline and Tomasz Różycki's Colonies, which won the Northern California Book Award and was shortlisted for the International Griffin Poetry Prize and the Oxford Weidenfeld Translation Prize. Her translation of Różycki's To the Letter is forthcoming from Archipelago Books in 2023. She is currently an associate professor of creative writing at Cal Poly. Joanna Huss, whose translation we just read, is professor of translation studies and Polish and Russian translation at Kent State University. You may remember her from our episode on Różewicz. Her research concerns collaborative translation, self-translation, 20th and 21st century Russian and Polish literature, and issues at the intersection of literature and philosophy. She has edited special issues of the Polish Review on Olga Tokarczuk and Stanisław Lem. Her translations have appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, Times Literary Supplement, Harper's, The Atlantic, Paris Review, Field, Zvezda, Boston Review, Non-Site, and New Ohio Review, among others. Her books of poetry translation include Miracle Fair, Selected Poems of Wisława Szymborska, published by Norton, and Sobbing Superpower, Selected Poems of Tadeusz Różewicz, also published by Norton. Her collected poems of Zuzanna Ginczanka is forthcoming in 2024 from Zephyr Press. She is the recipient of the 2020 Michael Heim Prize for Collegial Translation. Joanna, Anna, and Mira, thank you so much for joining me. If I can ask Anna, since you're a historian, a question that's just about, sort of more historical, which is, there's a lot of fascination with Ginczanka's biography right now. There have been monodramas, based on her life and so forth in Polish. So maybe you can, give us the background. What milieu does she come out of? What is, what can you, tell us about her life? She was successful at a very young age. Give us a little of the background.
Zuzanna Ginczanka, born as Ginzburg, was born in Kyiv in 1917. Soon after her birth, her parents, who were refugees from the fallen Russian Empire, moved to her maternal grandparents, who lived in the Polish eastern edges in the provincial town of Volhynia, in Równe, Wołyńskie, now Rivne, that is located in Ukraine. And interestingly, Ginczanka, even though she was born to a Polish mother herself, never received Polish citizenship. So in some sources, we can read that she had so-called Nansen passport, which served as a form of identification that was issued to Russian refugees, stateless people who didn't manage to acquire any other nationality. But this fact is really not confirmed in documentation. It's just recollection of some people that knew her. So we know that Ginczanka was a precocious child who began writing very early on. Her poem Grammar was distinguished in the Young Poets Tournament and was published in the most prestigious, important Polish literary journal, Wiadomości Literackie, in 1934. A year later, in 1935, she left her provincial towns, Równe, for Warsaw, where a year later, in 1936, she began studying pedagogy. And in those years, just before the war, in the years when she was studying there between 36 and 39, she gained recognition among Polish literary giants, such as Julian Tuwim, Witold Gombrowicz. And during that time, she wrote both lyrical poems as well as satirical pieces, mainly for the magazine Szpilki. And one more thing that I should add to this time period, in 1936, she published her first and unfortunately last volume of poetry, O Centaurach. So with the beginning of the Second World War, the Nazi aggression, increasingly aggressive anti-Semitism, as a Jewish woman, she found herself in an immediate danger. So when the war began, she was actually visiting her grandmother in Równe. But soon after, she moved to newly occupied by the Soviet Union, Lviv, where she married a man named Michał Weinzeyer, who she supposedly married in hopes of him being able to help her grandmother, who was staying still in Równe. When Germans entered Lviv, she refused to move to a Jewish ghetto in Lviv and instead decided to hide at Jabłonowska Street. And when she barely escaped a number of denunciations in Lviv by infamous concierge of the house where she lived, Chominova, she decided to move to Krakow to continue hiding. But in Krakow, she was eventually arrested and executed in May 1944, so a year before the end of the war. So let me just add two more things that may better showcase how complex our readings of her life is, but also will help me to act a little bit as a historian in this group and look at Ginczanka's biographies as her historiography and part of ongoing conversations about different ways we can interpret her life. So, of course, there are many prisms through which we can interpret her life and the role of her activities, her poetry in her life. But there seems to be two major interpretations. One is an interpretation coming from Izolda Kiec, who in one of her books, in her latest books, interprets Ginczanka's life through betrayal. So according to Kiec, Ginczanka experienced betrayals throughout her entire life, starting with the fact that she was betrayed by her father, who very early on abandoned the family. Then she was also betrayed by her mother, who left Ginczanka with her grandmother in Równe and herself left with her new husband for Spain. Ginczanka was a beautiful woman that attracted many men. But as Kiec shows, none of these men loved Ginczanka the way she needed to be loved and protected. So in a sense, all these men were betraying her in Kiec's reading. And here, perhaps the most telling is an example of Józef Łobodowski, a man who was interested in Ginczanka and yet who refused to be with her, or perhaps not refused, but decided not to be with her because his family were not happy with him being with a Jewish woman. Finally, there is a betrayal, the most famous one that everyone who reads Ginczanka knows, is the betrayal by her by a Polish neighbor, Chominova, an event that inspired one of her most moving poems, Non omnis moriar. And actually, Kiec mentions one more betrayal. She claims that Ginczanka was betrayed by her looks. She was beautiful, but had a very Semitic face, and as such could not go unnoticed. So that's Kiec. On the other hand, we have also interpretations of Ginczanka's life coming from another specialist in Ginczanka studies, if I can call it that way, a literature specialist and philosopher, Agata Araszkiewicz, who sees Ginczanka as someone very radical, someone who is coming to Polish literature from the margins, and as a woman, as a Jew, as a poetess, And from those margins, she becomes a Pole by choice, even though a formal confirmation of her citizenship is denied to her. And as such, she challenges Polish literary traditions and participates in the process of feminization of the Polish writings at the time. And as such, she destabilizes multiple meanings. She invites us to reflect on place of women poets, stigmatizing role of beauty, women-man relationships, even the relationship between humans and nature. And let me just say one more thing. One of the categories that Alashkiewicz uses to analyze Ginczanka's work is that of melancholy, this deep sense of sadness that comes out of the essence of one's being. And that perspective of seeing her through melancholy helps us see, in Alashkiewicz's reading, helps us see Ginczanka as someone from multiple margins who throughout her entire life essentially struggled to remain the author of her own story.
If I can ask all of you, why is there such an explosion of interest in Ginczanka right now? I mean, we've got 4 translations either out or coming out into English. We do have all this debate in Poland, as well as as I said, theatrical works, exhibitions inspired by Ginczanka, and so forth. What do you think is responsible for the sudden explosion of interest?
It's really wonderful to see this very quick entrance of Ginczanka into English just this year, or early next year. I think, Joanna, your book is coming out, and it provides ultimately a chance to compare translations, which is the best possible scenario when reading poetry in translation, especially. So I'm very happy to see it. I've thought a lot about why now? What is it about this moment? Why this year? And I think there are a number of reasons. One is timeline. The most comprehensive collected poems that Kyiv put together came out in 2020. And so here we are a couple years later.
This one, right?
Yes. That one we all have it right at hand, right? Because it's such a wonderful resource, and she's done us such a great service to put it all together. And I know in talking with Alex Braslavsky, whose translation came out in February, she really credits that book with her discovery of Ginczanka. And so we have to factor in the time it takes to fiddle over these poems, because they're poems that really bear a lot of fiddling, a lot of wordplay, a lot of specificity, they're like tight little knots often. So there's that aspect. There's also Ginczanka's themes. I agree with Anya very much that Ginczanka is someone we continue to discover. I would, for example, describe her work as encapsulating a kind of feminist eco-poetry. I wouldn't necessarily use that as a term for her in her lifetime, but her interest in decentering the human within the natural world, or thinking about the human as, she says in Deklaracja, I am nothing other than a wise variety of animal. So that really taps into the conversation we're having right now in the Anthropocene era, and what kind of work poetry can do in decentering the human or recentering the human within the natural and animal realm. But there are other ways to think about her work as well, other themes that I think are compelling. Certainly, what does it mean to rediscover a Jewish writer today? Amongst all of the other narratives that we have in our minds of Jews who struggle, or Jews who came to an untimely and tragic death, What does it mean to tell that story today? So that's also, I think, an interesting and compelling thing that we're struggling with right now. So her work really allows us to have the conversations that feel most compelling right now.
Since you mentioned that the book kind of Getz's collection is certainly a major motivating factor, that we have the text, right? So now we know, but a lot of the text is manuscript. It comes from notebooks and things like that. And I'm wondering, I know you've been working on this for a long time, Joanna. Can you say a little something about the textual history and how we have? Well, we have, of course, she was well published in her youth. That first award-winning poem was when she was 16, if I'm not mistaken, if I'm counting right. So 16, 17. But so how do we have what we have?
I really would like to go back a little bit and add something to the
yes, please.
The conversation that we are having about why Ginczanka now. And I think I wanted to just say that it's much more in the making. Kietz has been working on it since the 90s. And we also have been coming to terms with the themes that are present in Ginczanka for at least 2-3 decades. So in a way, it is a kind of comes at the heels of us thinking through a lot of things that are very central themes in Ginczanka's poetry, including rejection of meta-narratives. Ginczanka rejects almost all of the meta-narratives. You will probably have a chance to look at it in the poem called Wyjaśnienie na marginesie, or as I call it, commentary or side commentary, where the narratives of creation, the meta-narratives of Exodus, all the narratives, also meta-narratives of our dominance over the world, are being questioned. So, Ginczanka also fits into our kind of colonial questioning of the colonial narrative, and we can maybe talk a little bit about that later. But and also of course rediscovery of these wonderful Jewish women, some of which lost their lives to Holocaust, some of whom survived and but never came to prominence. And that is something that is a work of a number of prominent scholars, both in Poland and outside of Poland. And I'm talking about women who were writing in Polish, women who were writing in Yiddish. So that's also part of the interest in Ginczanka. She's part of a larger dialogue of bringing into life and into prominence those lives and works of women who were overlooked.
On that point, I'd recommend that our viewers take a look at our recent episode on Devorah Fogel, the Polish Jewish writer who wrote in Yiddish by choice. She learned Yiddish to write poetry, which is its own interesting phenomenon, which was not the case with Ginczanka. She stuck to her native language.
The time is really ripe on so many different levels, and because Ginczanka unites all these themes. Her poetry is so incredibly rich, it cannot be reduced to any of those kind of paradigms, although each one way of looking at it, either through ecofeminism, different feminist readings, different post-colonial readings, all kind of add a dimension. But her poetry is so rich that it accommodates all these readings, and the themes are present there.
She's a poet who wants to abolish dualism, whether it be the dualism of body and soul, or man and woman, or human and nature. So, Joanna, I really love what you're saying there about how she's a poet who resists that kind of reduction.
She's a poet of a process. So what, she is, to her, life not is a topic of poetry, the very kind of physiology, the very transformations that occur in her as a woman, as a poet, all of these, and the whole process of writing. So textual history here is extremely important.
Since you bring up this poem, side commentary, or written in the margins, maybe we can look at it, since both of you, I know, are working on it. And I should say that these translations are works in progress, that, they're, subject to revision. I know in my own work that, nothing is done until it's in print or until the words come out of my mouth, if I'm speaking. So I'm sure there are areas that, that you're all thinking about in these works, and that every translation is an interpretation, a reading, and we're not necessarily looking for what's the best translation, but what reveals different layers of meaning. So maybe with this poem, maybe Anna, could you read it in Polish?
Wyjaśnienia na marginesie.
Yes.
Nie powstałam z prochu, nie obrócę się w proch. Nie zstąpiłam z nieba i nie wrócę do nieba. Jestem sama niebem, tak jak szklisty strop. Jestem sama ziemią, tak jak rodna gleba. Nie uciekłam znikąd i nie wrócę tam. Oprócz samej siebie nie znam innej dali. W zdętym płucu wiatru i w zwotnieniu skał muszę siebie tutaj rozproszoną znaleźć.
Written in the margins. I was not taken from dust. To dust I will not turn back. I did not descend from heaven and will not return there. Here I am, the sky, like a glassy ceiling. Here I am, the ground, like fertile earth. I did not flee out of nowhere and will not return there. I know no other distance than myself. Inside this swollen lung of wind and this calcified stone, I now must find my scattered self.
Joanna, would you like to read your version?
Commentary. I was not made from dust, nor unto dust shall I return. I did not come down from heaven, nor shall I return there. Like a glass dome, I am the heavens. I am earth, like the fertile soil. I did not escape from anywhere, nor shall I return there. I know of no other beyond myself, in the full lungs of the wind, and in the calcified rocks scattered here, I must find myself.
How do you react to reading each other's versions? That's because you're both like more engaged in it than I am, right? I mean, you're both, one of my mentors, Louis Irabarn, who was a great translator of Miłosz and Lem and many other writers. I mean, he used to say that that translation was the most intimate form of criticism, because you have to justify every word, you have to account for every word. So between the so what are your readings of each other's translation? Just, I know maybe you're just first encountering them right now.
It's so exciting to hear your solutions, Joanna. I love the line about, I know no other beyond myself. That's so great. I know no other distance than myself. That to me is such a crucial line in the poem. It's the longest line in the poem in which she's talking about distance. And I have my version's partly going for rhythm as well, da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. But that wordplay of the beyond and beyond, I think, is awesome.
Well, it's a very interesting, I kind of come from Ginczanka. as someone who is kind of taking issue with the patriarchy and the kind of the biblical commentary. So because I had, several times while translating this poem, and it's really interesting to hear your interpretation, because mine is a little bit skewed into this sort of rejection of meta-narratives, so of the biblical meta-narratives. And I just had a revelation, last night, that in some ways, this is a second poem in which she takes on Genesis, the first one being Process, where it starts with "in the beginning," na początku, and here it's a continuation of her dialogue with the story of creation, but also her casting herself in the in not just rejecting the myths. And what I hear in your translation is kind of her taking ownership, her coming as a poet, and as a creator, not a creation. So here, I think for me, the most important thing was looking at the sort of Hebrew scriptures and kind of looking at, the dome as this kind of a physical entity. So it was kind of interesting to see what you did with that.
I was also curious about the title, because here we have two very different titles. I'd be interested what people's reactions are to those. For example, with Anna, where you were talking about the importance of the margin as a concept, and that to me is very important to retain in this poem, that the marginalia is the place where writing continues, where critique continues, where clarification continues. And that's just this trace of an infinite ongoing process, which I also interpret as that infinite distance within the self.
My interpretation was a little bit more narrow, and it was kind of more about the kind of Talmudic writing. So it's, in a sense, she is kind of working up a courage to basically be commenting on the scriptures, and also not only that, but also writing her own self, as a creation, herself but in the tradition of the sort of a Genesis, so the Genesis of herself as a poet, she's finding herself. So she rejects the meta narratives in favor of the kind of epistemologically grounded self-discovery. So it's she's going into the calcified rocks, the kind of lungs of the wind, and she's scattered and she's putting herself together. So kind of looking at the rejection of metaphysics in kind of at the same time in favor of something that is kind of based on what's here and now, and kind of almost there's interesting thing about geology. I don't know if you noticed about in her poetry, but it's something that I'm beginning to only now name and discover. That is her kind of interest in way of using both scientific and especially geological terminology to as a metaphor for discovery of the self. So,
Mira, I think you probably also were referring though to the sort of Talmudic writing in the writing in the margins, right? I mean, I think that's there as well. But something that was struck me as interesting in your translation, Joanna, is that on the one hand, you're highlighting the rejection of meta narrative, but on the other hand, you're also using very much like this kind of biblical language that we see in English translation of the Bible. from dust unto dust. That's that it's a little archaic, it's a little intentionally so, and interestingly so, and that's an interesting choice to me,
because I wanted it to be recognizable. I wanted it to be. I don't know how many people will read. I'm arguing and kind of pleading for notes, but oftentimes those come at the end of the book. So it's it's hard to kind of count on the reader to have the time and have the desire. So whatever I can fit into the poem itself, it's going to be there. And I wanted it to be recognizably biblical.
I think that the biblical references are very stark and very direct in a lot of her work. Here it seems very stark and direct, so much so that I think we can trust the reader to pick up on it. We're talking about dust, we're talking about heaven, we're talking about sky, and so that reference is the official text in the center of the page. And she's interested in what kind of annotation she might scatter around.
Also a theme that we deal with in our episode on Bruno Schulz very early in the series, since he thematizes that idea of writing in the margins.
What's striking for me in this and some other poems is that, she's constantly struggling with, as Joanna put it together, sort of to put together her scattered self, right? But that's in a sense speaks to the larger historical context, right, of the place that Jewish youth had or was hoping to find in the interwar Poland. So we usually see the 1920s and early 1930s as sort of this time of relative optimism. Poland regains independence. There was hope that it will become a democratic country that is open to all different minorities, right? And increasingly with the 1930s, you see much more disappointment, even angst, something that Kenneth Moss argues very convincingly in his latest book, The Unchosen People, sort of that this growth of ethno-nationalism and anti-Semitism and growing anti-Semitism was actually affecting, Jewish youth initially so optimistic, sort of attributing or contributing to the sense of catastrophism, right? And I see that she's sort of balancing here in this poem, and I hope I'm not, adding too much to the interpretation, sort of trying to remain positive, trying to remain the author of her own story, trying to believe that, that she has a right to be the author of her life, and at the same time there are those forces that are coming from the outside that are for which she's losing her balance, right? And then she's in the midst of it trying to put together all the scattered pieces of herself.
Would you like to look at the mythology of joy, or the joyful mythology?
Mitologia radosna. Jak atlas dźwigam hardo na barkach własne niebo. Wzwyż się przedłużam pionem azotu, pary, tlenu. Barometr serca krew ciśnie jak rtęć srebro, by zmierzyć ciężar szczęść na skali pulsu przemów. Lecz nie znam wcale cyfr, o których cyrkle prawią, i nie znam wcale liczb barometrycznych ciśnień. Gdy nocą brzemię nieb w konarach moich ramion zakwita jaśnią gwiazd, jak drobnokwietną wiśnią. To jest nie lada sztuczka, udźwignąć własne szczęście. Radośnie, świętokradzko, nie ugiąć się pod niebem. Jak atlas dźwigam hardo na barkach siną przestrzeń, na której słońce z miedzi jaskrami znaczy przebieg.
Another one where we're going to encounter this kind of encounter between mythic language and the language of science. This time, Joanna, would you like to read your version first?
For years, I've been trying to publish crossed out versions of translations. And finally, Hopkins Review, they have a completely new leadership inspired one. And Dara Malik and Sevi Paris allowed me to do a a version with all the crossouts, all the annotations. So it's kind of hard to read, but I will try to read it because it has so many crossouts. So, joyful mythology. Like Atlas, I proudly carry my own sky on my shoulders. I stretch straight upward like nitrogen, oxygen, steam. The barometer of my heart presses blood like quicksilver to measure the weight of happiness on the scale of the pulse of speech. But I don't know the digits that compasses read, and I don't know the numbers for barometric pressure when at night the heavy heavens in my limbs, my arms, bloom with the brilliance of stars, like the fine blossoms of cherries. This is the trick. This is quite the trick, to bear your own happiness, joyfully, sacrilegiously, unbowed by heaven. Like Atlas, I carry proudly on my shoulders a dark blue space on which the copper sun marks its course with buttercups.
Mira, would you like to read yours?
Certainly. This poem, like so many of her poems, gets really, really skinny at the end. And that's always the most challenging moment. Not only is the end of a poem challenging, you have to figure out how to land it in English, but here she's playing around with the positioning of words and the highlighting of words. And so it's really fascinating to hear the differences in our translations at the end. Mythology of joy. Like Atlas, with pride, I bear the sky on my shoulders, lengthening high along a plumb line of nitrogen, of vapor, of oxygen. Heart barometer forcing blood like silver mercury to measure the weight of happiness on the scale of pulsing speech. But the compass's geometry means nothing to me, or the units used for atmospheric pressure when the burden of sky at night in the boughs of these arms blooms with shining stars like tiny flowers in a cherry tree. This is quite the trick, to carry my own happiness, joyfully, sacrilegiously, to not buckle under the sky. Like Atlas with pride, I bear my blue expanse, while the copper sun turns buttercups to chart the way.
What a joy. I think that's, quite a joy for readers to have such two different interpretations of that ending, two different landings, it's amazing. As I said before, it's a humbling experience to deal with Ginczanka, because this young woman, she was 16. She was 16 years old when she wrote it, and yet she does these careful blending of the two traditions of the Atlas myth, both from the Greek and from the Roman. I mean, she's putting her lessons to work.
Mira, you decided to follow the original syntax more closely, and I guess you're always struggling with the difference between where the syntax leads in different languages. I mean, the way is literally where the poem ends, but buttercups is such a shocking thing. This is Atlas carrying the world through the universe, and he's relying on these the simple flower. That's and there's a compelling reason for doing it both ways. I think. Mira, you had a comment.
One thing that I feel is a fundamental element of this poem that we haven't mentioned yet is that it's a thread that runs through really all of her poems for me, is that language belongs to the body. We have that measuring the weight of happiness on the scale of pulsing speech, right? The speech and the heart are combined. Certainly, as poets, we know that meter is tied to the heartbeat, but that's for her this essential element of becoming the self and embodying the self through language. So I feel like this poem, even beyond its interrogation of the usual narrative and myth, I see it as this discovery of the joy of writing, which always carries a heaviness or a weight to it. You can never have kind of this just simple, pure joy in Ginczanka.
Absolutely. I think that what I love the way that your poem, your translation ends, and I love the fact that you bring up the embodied nature of her poetry, and the kind of pressure, the kind of joy, the kind of physiological almost process that writing is. And I think that, again, you mentioned also the false dichotomies between the body and the spirit that moves one to write poetry. Here in Ginczanka, you have both. You have this. You have the kind of physiological process of writing, the embodied writer.
Anya and I work by meeting and discussing my initial, very messy translations. And she always reads the Polish, and then I go through my messiness and we discuss all of the nuances of meaning, of course. But one of the most joyful moments is seeing Anya struggle over the sounds of the Polish. Because, as a non-native speaker of Polish, sometimes I'm trying to get my mouth to move in those ways and it doesn't want to, and it's hard for me. But to realize that it's also hard for a native speaker, to me, really underscores the fact that language is tactile. It's this physical thing. And that's why she has so much wordplay, right? It's a way to get it into our bodies as we're encountering the poems.
There's certainly poets who enjoy difficult words, even in English, like squinch and things like that. Maybe we should look at this poem Futro, because it is rife with such words like kośćca, and so forth that are and it deals with this sort of embodiment, this sort of becoming what Deleuze calls becoming animal, if we want to go in that direction. I don't know if we do, but this being on this borderline between being human and animal. Maybe we could. We've got to read this in Polish. So I don't know. Would you like to read it?
Sure. O rysie, żbiki i pumy, wypchane najpuszyściej, lisy o żółtych podszewkach i żółtych oczach ze szkła. O runo rozwieruszone, rozpięte, płasko i chytrze. Poranki rozwieruszone, napięte ciasno na snach. O grząskie, wilcze i gliwo leśne jak sosen w łosie. Chaosie niedźwiedziej szczeci, zamęcie zmąconych dni. Czeszę cię ostrą pogardą. O futro rozwianych mych wiosen. Sypkie, kosmate futro. Bez mięsa, kośćca i krwi.
Mira, we have your translation for this one.
Fur. Oh, lynxes, wildcats, and cougars stuffed over fluffed. Foxes with yellow lining and yellow glass eyes. Oh, naps spread backward, craftily flattened. Spread back mornings, stretched tense over dreams. Oh, forest floor of wolfish needles soaked to pine undercoat. Chaos of frizzly bear. Disarray of wavy days. I brush you out with harsh disdain. Oh, fur of my blown loose years. wispy, shaggy, meatless fur without bone or blood.
That's great. I mean, because I can tell that you're enjoying the wordplay there. Just as Ginczanka must have enjoyed it. And you have these one thing that I find interesting, sometimes reading reviews of Polish poetry, is that that sometimes people, the reviewers will react to the sound of the poem in English, but if they can't pronounce the poem in Polish, they have no idea what the correlations might be, and your use of words like lynxes and so forth are seems to be evocative of some of those kinds of connections. What are you thinking about in the sound of the poem in English?
For me, first and foremost, a sensuality, that there's a kind of an animal sensuality, or where there's this combination of the plant realm and the animal realm that is getting mixed up. I think back to that scattered self. Here she's kind of scattering or mixing up meanings like wolfish needles and pine undercoat instead of the wolf's undercoat and pine needles. So there's moments like that, or the play that I rendered as Frizzly Bear instead of Grizzly Bear. Mm-hmm. I'm bringing a little bit of California into the poem there. But that ultimately, I agree with Kietz that this poem is a nightmare poem. This poem is different tonally than maybe some of her more optimistic poems, and that it's a girl thinking about fur and hair as she combs fur or hair, trying to figure out what kind of future there is for herself, and it's not looking so great. We have at the beginning these very tamed, groomed wild animals that have been stuffed and overfluffed. We have at the end this brushing out that is taming the blown loose years. If you're stuffed, if you're tamed, where's your blood? Where's your bone? So on the one hand, I think the tone has a playfulness to it, and the wordplay has a playfulness to it. On the other hand, it's like the weight of joy, right? It's also got this real struggle and this feminist critique within the description.
It's also kind of the critique of our cruelty towards animals as well. I mean, it's all of it, it's there's so many layers here, and it is very much about our forced right of way as well, and of course, I think that I loved your reading of it, and I like your embodied reading in the translation too.
One thing that Anya and I talked about that maybe you'd want to speak to, Anya, is how, at least for me, when I read this poem, I cannot help but think about the anecdote about when she was imprisoned at the very end of her life and the significance of her hair in that moment.
It's actually a very important, I think, element in all the carceral studies or studies of women in carceral concentration camp prisoner settings. So supposedly Ginczanka, once she was imprisoned, and first she was kept at Montelupi prison in Krakow, then moved to a different prison. She was very afraid of being tortured, but most of all, she was really afraid of losing her hair. And that's something that happened to her as her Nazi interrogators, used her hair as a way of torturing her. It's a larger phenomenon because, hair is an attribute of woman's beauty, of femininity, right? But it's in different cultures, it can be also read as a source of wisdom, a source of strength. it speaks to a very tragic moment if we're referring to the moment of, how she took care of her hair. Now she was afraid of losing her hair, and sort of what are the larger readings of that fear. It speaks to potentially the most tragic moment in her life when she's imprisoned and is fighting for her life, even though she must have known that there is no really salvation from the situation that she was in.
If we can move to one of the later poems, but a satirical one that points to some of the irony that we see in the one poem that everybody seems to know of Ginczanka, which is Non omnis moriar, where she, on the one hand, is citing Horace, but on the other hand is bitterly pointing the finger at her denunciators that caused her to be arrested. Can we look at your translation, Joanna, of The Hunt? Łowy?
Should we read it in Polish first?
Łowy. W gąszczy przeszłości, w zamierzchłe dzieje, w groźne, zawiłe bory i knieje, z dłonią wplecioną w uprząż i grzywy, czarni na koniach pędzą myśliwi. Nozdrza rozdęte, tułów schylony, usta zacięte, wzrok wytężony. Pędzą jak wichry czarnym galopem za wątłym śladem, zanikłym tropem. Jakiż to zapał wzrok im rozszerza? Czegoż szukają? Jakiego zwierza? Jakiż to poryw pierś im wypręża, godny rycerza i godny męża. Pędzą myśliwy w zamierzchłe dzieje, gdzie ślad porasta i trop czernieje. W gąszczach przeszłości z uporem mrówki babki szukają, babki Żydówki. Babki Żydówki bliźniego swego, wroga ciętego, drucha dobrego. A gdy wywęszą babkę jak łanię, to w surmy, w trąby, w rogi i granie. O łowy piękne, o dumne łowy, w tajnych, sekretnych dziejach alkowy. O wielkie, harde, wzniosłe tropienia, godne rycerzy i godne pienia.
Thank you for reading so we could hear the four-beat couplets, rhymed couplets, which is perhaps a sign of that we know that something is up here, in terms of humor, satire, despite the dark themes of it. Would you like to read your translation, Joanna?
The Hunt. Into the depths of time, the thickets of the past, the dangerous, intricate woods, the groves of pines, dark-clad hunters on horseback, hands clutching halters, leaving no slack, on the scent, torso bent, jaws taut, gaze straight. A black gallop, a blasting gale, each follows a scent, a vanishing trail. What is the drive that widens their eyes? What is the prey that they're trying to find? What gallant quest puffs up their chest, fit for a noble or fit for a knight? The hunters rush into the distant past, traces grown over and tracks gone black. In the thickets of the past, with the stubbornness of ants, they trace a Jewish grandmother, or even an aunt, the Jewish grandmother of their brethren, their fierce enemy, or their close companion. And when they sniff her out like a doe, triumphant trumpets and bugles will blow, a splendid hunt, majestic hunt in the hidden vastness of the distant past. Oh, glorious, proud, and lofty chase, worthy of song and knightly fame.
So maybe, Anna, you can give a little of the historical background as to who these hunters are.
There is an ongoing discussion among the scholars that are dealing with Ginczanka at what point she noticed or started experiencing anti-Semitism around her, right? And that is sort of hopefully giving a little bit of background for a conversation about this poem, because she doesn't have many poems when she is not only noticing anti-Semitism, but also speaking as, a Jewish poet. So she lived in Volhynia in Równe, there was 60% Jewish town, and we know of a number of anti-Semitic incidents in Równe. So even though she lived in, fairly assimilated household, not very religious, we can be pretty sure that she was aware not only of anti-Semitism around her, but she also experienced a number of anti-Semitic incidents. There's those stories of, her school friends, girlfriend at school not being friendly towards her. People interpret it as a sign of jealousy, but potentially was also, just a sign of anti-Semitism, right? Also, if we look at her closest friends, they were all Jewish. So even though, she lived among Poles, she spoke Polish, she was Polish, her closest friends were actually Jewish. So again, she was slightly from the margins, right? Very close to the center, but not quite there. And then, of course, the 1930s, the beginning of the 1930s and everything after 1935, that's growing ethno-nationalism, increasing anti-Semitism, something that she was fully aware of and something she was afraid of. We know that she knew that she's being recognized as a Jew, and she felt increasingly threatened. And I think that poem speaks directly to that. So those are the years, again, of this, existential angst that Ken Moth talks about, right, in Unchosen People, where the Jewish minorities, the Jewish population of Poland is noticing that there's really no way out. No matter how much they try, how much they feel part of Poland, they will never be fully recognized as Polish. And what's striking in this poem too is that it reminds me a little bit about Non omnis moriar, where she talks about bliscy moi, right, my dear ones. And then there is this larger conversation. Who is she really talking about? Who are the dear ones? And of course, and it sounds to me like she's basically talking about her fellow Poles, everyone around her, right? People, her friends, people who essentially are failing, people like her who are coming from the margins, who are from different minorities, who are not able to stand up for them. And that poem seems to me that it speaks to a very similar feeling. I don't know if you, Joanna, would like to comment on that.
Well, I think that she is standing up. She's standing up proudly and boldly through satire. And I think that satire was a very effective weapon. Inaction was not an option for her. She was someone who was brave and bold. And I think that she here is using her words as she mocks mercilessly, very effectively, through this. Of course, it's a tragic poem, and Yusuf Hen reads it so beautifully. But I think it's it is a way kind of serving up the dish of hatred, back to those who think they have the right, and it's quite powerful. I think it is, but these are words, so they're both effective, and as we know, quite effective. Because of the poem in Non omnis moriar, it landed somebody in prison for 4 years. So
you are absolutely right. But just I wanted to add one sentence to what I previously said. This line: babki Żydówki bliźniego swego, wroga ciętego druha dobrego. Right. This play on
absolutely,
your friend and he's your enemy. Right. Bliscy moi.
Absolutely. Yeah. I absolutely, I see the similarity. I think you're absolutely right. And I think that, again, Ginczanka is a testament to the fact that words matter and words can have a power, actually, to legal power also. So it's these two poems are very much they go hand in hand in a way. I mean, it's a way of standing up, of being able to change things.
And this was, published. This wasn't just for, the desk drawer. This wasn't, something that was just in the notebooks, but it was published in Szpilki, which was, widely read. Anna.
What you said about, using words as a weapon, I think it's an incredibly important thing to remember about her. And I think also something that I tried to express earlier, that if we look at the Polish Jewish youth in interwar Poland from this historical, sociological perspective, right? We see those elements of, optimism and then disappointment and angst, existential angst, but also this very historical angst, like there's no way out, right? And she seems to be someone who is struggling to maintain hope and who struggling to convince herself that there is a way out, perhaps still. There is words are a weapon, right? We can still make this work. Interestingly enough, we know that when the war started, there were a lot of attempts to actually take her, help her leave Poland, and she refused to leave. She decided to stay. And there are, again, like different reasons of why she could have insisted on staying. One of them is she wanted to be closer to her grandmother, but another one is this was her place. This was her country. This is where she wanted to stay. It was not a question of choice, right? She was not born here, but she grew up in Poland. This was the only place she knew. This is the only place that she defined as her, that she saw as her home.
I wanted to just say that this is that also goes into this narrative of Jewish passivity. These, the Jews of Szpilki were not passive. They were definitely serving it up. I mean, they were through humor. They were not having it. They were absolutely pointing the way we continue to point absurdities, in this country through humor, through when we can't do things any other way. We use humor to show that we don't agree, that we're not in for it, so that's very important too. And again, we are in the moment where this is being recognized. The whole paradigm of Jewish passivity is being challenged.
All right. So on that note, we're already well over time. But let me ask you, as I do at the end of every program, since there are many students who might be watching the show, thinking about studying Polish literature or Polish studies in the future. I know Joanna, you already talked about the translation program at Kent State, but I think it was in transformation during our last meeting, the Różewicz episodes. Do you have an update about translation studies at Kent State?
It is alive and well. We have a very strong PhD program. We have an MA program, but our PhD program is absolutely thriving, and we have better students each year, even though it's very hard for us. We kind of we're tickled by how good the applicant pool is, and that each year it gets better. So I think that for somebody who is interested in issues of translation, theoretical issues of translation that are not language specific, that's a really strong program.
And Anna, you're at University of Michigan, Dearborn, is that correct?
Yes.
Tell us a little about the program there. We've had Ben Paloff from Michigan and Ann Arbor, of course, a number of times. But tell us about the if you wanted to do Polish studies at Dearborn, what could you do?
You can study with me. I am a professor of Polish and Polish American studies there. Actually, it's an endowed position, but I am the only one. Dearborn used to be a major, there used to be a major Polish community, but that belonged to the past right now. So if you're interested in studying Polish at a smaller regional university, you can study with me.
And Mira, you're now at Cal Poly.
I actually teach creative writing mainly, and I came to study comparative literature after having done an MFA in creative writing. And anyone interested in literary translation, ultimately I'd say just study writing. Learn how to craft in your target language. You can study creative writing with me. I also teach literature courses that have always a comparative element, in which I'm constantly insisting on studying the translated status of a text. So we do a lot of looking at multiple translations side by side. And then I also focus on ecopoetry. And that's, one of the things that got me interested in Ginczanka is how she ties into that area of my research.
Well, thank you all so much for joining me on the Ginczanka episode of Encounters with Polish Literature. We'll be putting in some links to the other translators who are working on Ginczanka on our main introductory page on the Polish Cultural Institute New York's website. So thanks again for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Don't go away. Please subscribe and click the bell to stay on top of the program. Watch the credits for some recommendations about how you can support aid for Ukraine and for Ukrainians fleeing the war in their country. I'd like to thank all the people who helped make this series possible. The Polish Cultural Institute New York sponsors our program. Bartek Remisko, head of Humanities and Literature at the Polish Cultural Institute New York, is our executive producer. Natalia Iudin is my fellow producer and editor. Claudia Owona-Draber is head of communications at the Polish Cultural Institute New York. Our opening and closing music is by Radek Przedpełski. Thank you all for listening and reading along with us. Let's meet again in a month when we'll pick up our exploration of the pastoral in Polish literature from last month's discussion of Reymont's novel, The Peasants, by looking at contemporary novelist Wiesław Myśliwski with his excellent translator, Bill Johnston. See you then.
Jest to szary dzień, jak zawsze w tej okolicy. Cała sceneria wydaje się chwilami fotografią z ilustrowanej gazety. Tak szare, tak płaskie są domy, ludzie i pojazdy.